Warning, this content may be disturbing to some audiences. Subscribe, if you dare. The Vikings never wore horns on their helmets. The only reason we believe that is because of poems and tales of the Vikings saying they did so. Hey everybody, welcome to AskReddit. People ask Reddit. Historians of Reddit, what commonly accepted historical inaccuracies drive you crazy? Number 1. Albert Einstein did not fail mathematics in school, as is commonly believed. Upon being shown a column making this claim, Einstein said, "I never failed in mathematics. Before I was 15 I had mastered differential and integral calculus." Number 2. That Titanic was in any way badly designed, badly built, or badly operated by the standards of the time. In fact, there are so many ridiculous inaccuracies surrounding Titanic that it's hard to list even a fraction of them here. She was an incredibly seaworthy ship, much more so than any passenger ship around today. The iceberg tore a gash almost a third of the way down her side, and she still stayed afloat for more than 2 hours. In that time, all but 2 of her lifeboats were launched. There wasn't time to launch any more. She could have had 100 more lifeboats on board, but that wouldn't have helped without vastly more crew to operate them. Titanic's passengers genuinely did believe that she was practically unsinkable. When the time came to begin loading the lifeboats, many passengers thought they would be safer staying on Titanic. There wasn't time for the crew to wait around convincing more people to get in, so when a lifeboat was ready, if there was no one else waiting to get in, it had to go. This is why so many of Titanic's lifeboats left only half full. Titanic wasn't traveling too fast for the conditions, by the standards of practice around at the time. Further precautions were put into practice after the incident, but no one on board can be blamed for doing what anyone on any ship would have done the same. She wasn't built using substandard materials. This rumor goes around a lot these days because of an article that was written some time ago. What the article is supposed to mean is that there is much better quality steel available today. This was not the case in 1909. Additionally, Titanic's builders were paid on a fee plus materials basis. They were given a set fee to construct the ship, plus the cost of all materials used. There was no incentive to use anything but the best steel they could get their hands on. The shipyard had an excellent reputation, and would not risk tainting it by using bad steel, which could easily be noticed on inspection anyway. Titanic and her 2 sister ships Olympic and Britannic were also surprisingly maneuverable for their size, much more so than was expected. Some will tell you that Titanic's rudder was too small, but this simply isn't true. In fact, Olympic's wartime captain marveled at her maneuverability, and was even able to throw her into a sudden turn, ramming, and sinking, a German U-boat. Olympic was the only merchant vessel throughout the First World War recorded to have sunk an enemy vessel. There are loads more, but I'm supposed to be working right now so I won't list them all. Let me know if there are any more and I'll do my best to explain what I can. Number 3. Galileo's models at the time of the controversy were less accurate than the heliocentric geocentric models, for predicting movement of celestial bodies, important for navigation. There was ample reason to be skeptical. The Catholic response was primarily because he decided to insult the Pope, his patron, not his scientific views. Church views on the geocentric system were largely based on Greek models, not the scripture. Since his parody of the Pope was done within his works advocating heliocentrism, the Church requested he cease to publish them, but allowed to publish about other scientific subjects. He agreed to do so. He later broke that promise, leading to the famous trials. It wasn't a war against science. It was politics. Number 4. The Vikings never wore horns on their helmets. The only reason we believe that is because of poems and tales of the Vikings saying they did so. We found remains of Vikings and non-horned helmets after the idea that they had horns on their helmets was popularized. Just think about it, aren't horns on a helmet a little impractical and inconvenient? You would never use them, and it would make a great handle for the enemy to drag your head to the floor. Vikings never wore helmets with horns. Number 5. The common American myth that Jesse James was an American Robin Hood. Fiery rebel who killed unarmed and innocent people who posed no threat to him and robbed southern as well northern banks and trains. Jesse's murderer is frequently referred to as the coward Robert Ford. While Ford did shoot him while facing his back, Jesse James once shot an innocent man named John Sheets who was merely filling out a bank slip. Jesse James never gave any money back to people who needed it or really had any chivalrous qualities other than deluding himself that he was a Southern gentleman. Truth is that Jesse James was a domestic terrorist who stole and victimized dozens of people, killed innocents and aggrandized himself by stealing the success of others. Number 6. Croissants are not French. Everyone, including the French, associates them with France, but really the croissant is Austrian. After a baker in Vienna saw that the Turks were coming, the alarm was sound just in time. When eventually the Turks were beaten, the baker was allowed to make a celebrational pastry for the occasion. He created a crescent moon, since this was the Islamic and Turkish symbol. We skip to Marie Antoinette. She loved the croissant and took the recipe with her to France. From then on it became one of the most famous pastries of all time. Number 7. The following argumentation is quite ridiculous, but it gained some popularity starting in the late 19th century and was a staple of the German Christians movement during the Third Reich. When the Northern Kingdom, Israel, fell to the Neo-Assyrians in the 8th century BC, a part of its population was deported to other parts of the Assyrian Empire, 2 Kings 17, while the rest took flight to the southern kingdom Judah. The Assyrians then resettled the former northern kingdom with Aryan colonists from the area of Iran. Only in the very late 2nd century BC was Galilee forcibly Judaized, according to Josephus and 1 Maccabees 2, by the Hasmoneans. Therefore the conclusion is that Galilee at the time of Jesus was still predominantly Aryan, and it had only been Jewish, and bad Jews at that, for about 100 years. In all likelihood Jesus was an Aryan, and Aryans, whether from Iran, India or the northern Mediterranean, are known for having a much lighter complexion than Semites. The problems with this argumentation are: 1. This theory rests on a very large part of the population of Israel being either deported or fleeing south, which is very unlikely. Nobles being deported was common, and some people who could afford doing so certainly fled south. We can see their influence in the merging of stories from the northern, for example Jacob, and the southern kingdom, for example Abraham, in order to create a new pan-Jewish identity for Judah after the loss of Israel, but the vast majority of the people usually stayed wherever they were when their country changed hands. 2. There is no indication whatsoever of Iranian settlers in Israel. 3. Even if such a resettlement had happened, the basic idea that after deporting the local nobles you might replace them with settlers from abroad that are loyal to your empire is not that absurd. The notion that Israel would still have been ethnically Aryan 700 years later is just ludicrous. 4. And of course, the entire if they speak related languages they must be biologically related thing that all the Aryan worship is based on. Aryans equals speakers of Indo-European languages. Number 8. The idea that certain civilizations were uncivilized or underdeveloped. I'll give just a few examples of what I mean. 1. Native Americans. A lot of people think that the Native Americans were uncivilized, or that only the Mayans or the Inca were civilized. That is simply not true. Sure, a lot of them didn't have writing, but neither did the ancient Greeks until the 8th century BC, by which time many of their more well-known legends had already been created. Also, they didn't have the wheel. So what? The wheel would have been useless in traveling their jungles, and in the case of the Incas, their highly intricate road system. The Aztecs are also an excellent example. They weren't conquered by 400 conquistadors. In fact, Spanish chronicles speak of their warriors being so fearsome, and their weapons so powerful, that they could cut a horse's head off in a single cut, and some of the conquistadors died of fright. The reason the Spaniards won was because 3/4 the diseases they brought, and 1/4 all of the Native Americans all too happy to get rid of the Aztec they found. This goes for the North Americans too. They had some very complex civilizations that evolved and fell before the Europeans arrived, and their lack of great cities did not make them less cultured. Moreover, they had agriculture, just not in the form the Europeans were used to. Another point to make is that they haven't disappeared either. They've interbred, sure, but their cultures merged with the European cultures to create such interesting amalgamations as the Mexican culture, and their instruments and people are very much alive today. 2. Barbarians. There is a myth that European non-Romans were technologically underdeveloped, but the reason the Roman army won so many battles was mostly its professionalism, its capacity to adapt, and its tactics. Around the 2nd century BC the Roman Empire was already expanding, and the people they faced had castles, iron weapons, heavy armor, and in case you're thinking, well they must have been primitive castles or things like that, some of them were unassailable, the sort of fortification you have to starve out because your weapons aren't good enough to penetrate it. Their weapons were also good enough for the Romans to adopt many of them, same for their armor. There is a reason the Roman army was made up of all these different people, they all had things to bring into their war machine. 3. Pacific Islanders. People tend to see them as half-naked people running about in their little islands, completely unaware of the existence of the outside world, but that could not be further from the truth. Pacific Islanders had complex societies and kingdoms long before the Europeans arrived, and there is evidence that the people of Rapa Nui were aware of the existence of South America and even may have traded with the Atacamino culture. Similarly, their navigation methods were so amazing that they sailed and populated Madagascar from Indonesia. That's right, the population of Madagascar sailed all the way across the Indian Ocean to populate Madagascar. Also, despite people thinking that they didn't have property or things like that, the people of the Pacific had very clear laws on land ownership, and that extends to the Maori and the Australian Aborigines. It wasn't their fault that the Europeans didn't understand them. For Africa. And here is the biggest one. Africa, the continent that has borne fruit to some of the most spectacularly wealthy states in history, to kingdoms that traded in such a high volume of elephants that it drove many of their species extinct. The continent that created the empire that was closest to bringing Rome to its knees, and an empire so ancient that their monuments were as ancient to the Greeks as they are to us. What world history has done in terms of undermining their achievements, both good and bad, is insulting. I'm sorry if this sounds like a lecture, but it's always bothered me. And you have to consider I've left out all of India with its myriad empires, the Middle East with its ancient technology, the Inuit, Inuktitut, Aleut, Ket, Kamchatkans, Ainu, Sami and other people of the north. The Mapuche and Chono Selknam and Amara with their bodies so adapted to their environment they would be medical wonders today, and the Somali with their innumerable poets. Indeed, the world is a wonderful place, and every culture has been as interesting as the last. The idea that one is inferior because they didn't build roads, or because they didn't share your religion, or because they didn't have the concept of marriage is ridiculous, and it is what most bothers me about historical education today. Number 9. That Genghis Khan was just some mindless mass murderer and not one of the most impressive leaders in human history. This was a guy that prized education, the arts, freedom of religion, and equality. The main reason he has such a bad rap is that the Mongol Empire turned back just before conquering Europe. They were brilliant military tacticians and understood the incredible value of fear. If they had conquered Europe, Western history would be replete with how sweet it actually was to live under an empire that let them keep almost all of their religion/culture/laws while increasing their trading capabilities. They didn't become the world's largest empire just by killing and raping everybody. But, when they turned back because of their Khan's death back in Mongolia, all the Western historians were left with was fantastic stories about an unseen horde of savages. And the rest is history, aka wildly biased stories depending on their source. All that said, anybody with more history, feel free to add or correct me here. It's been a long while since I last researched the Mongolian Empire. Number 10. That Christopher Columbus was the only guy smart enough to figure out that the world was round and not flat. It was a well-known fact since the time of the ancient Greeks when Herodotus calculated the circumference of the Earth with a deviation of less than 1%. Make sure to share your personal story in the comments below and have the opportunity to be featured in a future video. Also, if you like these topics, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification button to continue seeing more content like this every day. See you next time.